It's called Fools, Liars, Cheaters, and Other Biblical Heroes. And I would commend it to you because it's a very good book. We're going to talk about Rahab this morning from our reading in Joshua about she was a prostitute, lived inside the city walls, and put out the crimson cord. She is one of the greatest heroes of the Bible. Kate, can you give me one? There's two parts to God's promise to Israel. One is release from slavery in Egypt. But there's a second part that is absolutely critical, where the whole promise falls apart if the second part doesn't happen. The second part is they had to be delivered into the land that God had promised their ancestors. So we have the first part through Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, where they're standing on the banks of the Jordan, but the promise hasn't really been fulfilled. And we see that Rahab, the prostitute, the Gentile, the liar, can God use someone like Rahab to become the linchpin for the execution of the entire promise? We have one more, okay? I guess sort of the point of this is that God can use anyone as long as we're willing to say yes when the time comes. When the moment comes, are we willing to say yes? And there can be complicating factors into whether we are actually willing to say yes. Do we feel that we're worthy enough to be used by God, or will we let a whole lot of baggage and the rest of from our past keep us from saying yes when the time comes? We have one more, Kate. Rahab is an unlikely linchpin hero. In our eyes, at least. She is a prostitute. Well, she's got 6 strikes against her from the start. We've talked about the role of women in biblical times. She's got 6 strikes against her. 3 are the fact that she was born female. In fact, if you recall, women were not allowed to read Torah. The daily prayer of men in those times was they would wake up and thank God for the morning. And one of the main things that they thanked God for was they said, "Thank you, God, that I was not born a woman." Women are not allowed to testify in court. They're considered property. Then Rahab has some more strikes against her, doesn't she? She's a prostitute. An interesting thing in what I don't want to get on a political rant, but I think women still haven't quite achieved parity, but in this time it was very bad. If you were a prostitute, you were considered very shameful. But if you were a man who visited prostitutes, there was no moral problem with that whatsoever. As long as you sort of kept things in control and you didn't do it all the time. There was no problem for a man to visit prostitutes. But the prostitute herself was extremely shameful. Rahab is a prostitute, she's a liar, she's a cheat, she's got 6 strikes against her. And yet God will use God's eyes and God's judgment rather than ours to look at Rahab in a different way. Doesn't seem to be very important to God that Rahab is a woman, that Rahab may be a liar or a prostitute. Seems to be just as usable to God as any male, upright male patriarch in society. We have one more. This is the Greek word, the Hebrew word for how the almost certainly male author of Joshua describes Rahab. And it's a despicable word. It's a shameful way of putting it. It's zonah. And he could have put it in other ways. He could have said she was, I don't know what the Hebrew would be, a woman of the night or a woman of the evening or whatever words. But no, for some reason he used the harlot, the whore, the shameful, shameful woman throughout the story. And I think perhaps it's because that's part of the story. Let me have one more, okay? These are casement walls. This was very typical of a Canaanite city in biblical times. And in the archaeological excavation of Jericho, these types of walls were found. The bronze gates that we heard about when Susan was reading, those gates were found in Jericho. It says that Rahab lived in the wall. So if you were wondering, what does that mean? She lived in the wall. Rahab, actually, she's living, there were walls that separated parts of here. And so she's actually living in the fortified defense of the city, this casement wall. She's actually living there, I think, perhaps historically, but also she's in this what we call liminal space, isn't she? She wants to be part of the community inside the wall, but she's not quite accepted. She's not on the outside, totally rejected. It's almost like she's sort of a semi-person. She's in an in-between space. She's in what we would call a liminal space. In reality, where she lives, but not just that, in this story, in what's just about to happen. So, Joshua, son of Nun, sends 2 spies in behind enemy lines to scope out the city for this potential invasion. I think it's pretty funny how the story says, Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 spies in from Shittim to go in and scope out the city. So they immediately went to the house of a prostitute. Times don't change very much. When I was in the Navy, we'd be on a ship and we'd be pulling into port. And the captain of the ship would come across the 1MC and the closed-circuit television in the ship, and he'd say, there were no women on ships back then, and he'd say, okay, good evening, gentlemen, we're about to pull into Naples. Want to have your port brief. Remember, don't drink too much, drink lots of water, don't get in fights with the locals, respect, blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, he'd pull out a map. And there'd be a red, he'd have a red magic mark, and he'd say, okay, up, first and down, or whatever. And he'd draw a line around this part of the city, which we would call the gut, which is where crime was high. You might find drugs, but certainly there were going to be a lot of prostitutes. And he said, this is the gut. Don't go down there. I'm going to have shore patrol. Don't want to see anybody down there. Of course, every sailor on the ship immediately pulled out their map and said, okay, wait a minute, where's that? Okay, we got to go, okay, everyone got it. And that's where everybody flocked. When we were in Naples, Italy one time, me and a bunch of buddies were walking through the gut, as 22-year-old men will do. And we looked in the window of a restaurant and said, isn't that the captain of the ship who told us not to come down in this area? And sure enough, he was drinking a glass of wine down at the gut. But I guess times don't change, so Joshua, son of Nun, sends them to go into the city and spy things out. And then, of course, they go immediately to the house of the prostitute. It sounds like almost any spy novel, Tom Clancy novel you've ever read, maybe. We have the combat leader sending spies in, going into enemy lines, infiltrating a city, scoping it out for the potential invasion. Then we have the king's secret police find out that they're in the city. The men are in danger. What's going to happen? And then, of course, we have the prostitute who becomes part of the story. Is she going to do the right thing and save the day? Or is she going to do what is certainly safe for herself and her family if she wants to escape execution right then by having her head likely cut off with a sword? What is she going to do? This is the liminal space that she is in emotionally and in this decision-making process as we go through our story. We have one more, okay? So we're about to have the invasion, and she goes to the secret police come, and she sends them on a wild goose chase. She lies. She lies to preserve life. And I think I've talked about this before, but I wouldn't say God likes liars, but when it comes to saving life, God seems to bend some of the rules. If you remember, the Egyptian midwives were ordered to kill all of the male children in Egypt, and they lied to Pharaoh, and God rewarded them for it. Rahab is now in a situation, so she lies to the king at great risk to herself, and she makes the decision to say yes to God's question, will you serve me? Can I use you? She sends the cops on a wild goose chase. She goes up to the men on the roof, and now she's in what I would call a very good negotiating position. Rahab is tough. She's a prostitute. She probably trust men and not to like men. And she makes a decision to trust these men anyway. And she does what we in the military call negotiates with them with her knee in their chest and her knife at their throat. Because if you've seen the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? George Clooney, as George Clooney would say, we're in a tight spot. They're on the roof in a public place. The gates are closed, and their route back to friendly lines is cut off. And she says, you know what? You want me to do something for you? I expect a lot in return. I want my family saved. My father, mother, brother, sisters. We don't know if any of them have jobs, but you know what? Rahab, the woman of the house, certainly seems to be in control, doesn't she? And she becomes reckoned one of the greatest heroes in the Bible. The attack will come, and the men say, okay, we've got a deal. What they were doing when they made that deal, though, they were breaking Deuteronomy 20:21, wherein this was a sacral war. And if you remember, these types of wars, Yahweh was actually doing the fighting. And every human being, every goat, every child, every cow belonged to Yahweh. They had a price. They were worth something as food or as a potential slave. They sacramentally belonged to Yahweh, and every single one of them has to be put to the sword. They must be killed. And yet these men say, okay, we'll spare you. Because they owed her big time. So she goes back, they go back, she puts them over the wall, they go back, the attack happens, and sure enough, Rahab and her family are brought out from that liminal space in between the walls. Not quite a member of the community, not quite a person. And they're brought out. Kate, can I get one? And they're brought out, and the attack happens. And everyone else is put to the sword. Rahab and her family are put in another liminal space outside the Israeli camp to protect the purity of the warriors. How is Joshua going to save Yahweh's honor by sparing the lives of these people? And how is Rahab going to be saved? And ultimately what happens? Only through love and forgiveness can this happen. Rahab and her family are brought into the Israeli family. Rahab the prostitute and her family become members of the tribe, members of the family. It's the only way Yahweh's honor can be preserved. God is always breaking down walls. God will break down our walls if we are willing to let God break down the walls that perhaps we've erected for ourselves. God broke down the walls for Rahab, and God broke down the walls for Israel, because after this, there will always be foreigners as part of the family of Israel. Let me have one more, Kate. We see that God's way of judging people and judging things is different. I think a lot of times in Christianity, we fear God's judgment, but I will tell you what, I will take God's judgment over human judgment any day of the week, because God's judgment is infinitely merciful, infinitely kind, and intimately filled with grace. Infinitely filled with grace. We have one more, Kate. If you don't think that God can use a woman and a prostitute for God's purposes, let's look at the genealogy of Jesus, Christ, the Messiah. Apparently, Rahab moved in with the Israelites, became part of the family, and she softened from the hard hooker that she had been for her whole life and married a prominent Israelite, Salmon. Rahab became the father of Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David the king, all the way down to Joseph, who was the legal father of Jesus. That doesn't give all of us tremendous hope I don't know what will. We have one more, okay? My stepdaughter, Teresa, as I start to wrap this up, is studying to be a doctor down in Austin, Texas. She's just starting school. And she sent me an email, and she told me that it was okay that I use this. She's going through another explosive phase, liminal space growth in her personal walk with Christ. And she watched the sermon from last week, and then she watched my devotional this week. And this young woman, remarkable young woman, I think can be a really wonderful example to all of us. So she said it was okay that I use this. She said, with regard to the devotional I did on Rahab, she said, "Good morning, Charlie. I love this upcoming subject of how God uses people who may not always have had the cleanest past. I think it does bring comfort to people to know this, and may help them reach out and understand God's love for all of us. I could be way off, but I believe God uses these people because I think they are more relatable as everyday sinners like we are." She's 22 years old, okay? Or 23. When I thought about all this and all the times in my past when I felt like God wanted me to spread the love and the word and I missed it, I think this is our whole purpose. I've been so focused on our true purpose now that my anxiety has gone way down and things have been put in perspective. What is important, which is to be kind and spread the love and the word of Jesus. To start, yesterday I made lunches and wrote scripture in each sack and passed them out to the homeless in Austin. With the pandemic and everything going on, I wanted to do something and was so eager to spread the love. Teresa said yes. We all can say yes too. Rahab, as I wrap this up, Rahab let God break down the walls of her own sin and her own shame, of her doing what she had to do to survive. She was willing to forgive herself. We say this every week in the Lord's Prayer, don't we? Forgive me as I've forgiven others. If you're prepared or you're willing to forgive other people, then you're ready to be forgiven yourself. And when you're ready to be forgiven yourself, then you're ready to say yes to God. Each one of us has made mistakes in our lives, but the wonderful thing that we have is that each day we wake up new and fresh after sleeping. And it's a new and fresh day with God, our friend. And it's a fresh start. Rahab thought she knew what she wanted. She probably, definitely wanted not to have to be a prostitute anymore. And she probably wanted at some point to be able somehow to move inside that inner wall, to become a person instead of a semi-person. She thought that was what she wanted. She said yes when the moment came, and God had something far more wonderful and useful for her. And God has something far more wonderful and useful for each one of us if we're ready just to say yes when the moment comes.